Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. This month, EyePatchNotes has a discussion on, they say, patterns, actions, and the theory of accidents. There's going to be a lot of verbiage in this one. Just follow along for a sec. I will do it in my own words afterward as well. Between the two of us, you will get a wording that is useful to you. EyePatchNotes also has a very useful graphic for this Parley. Returning to the topic of divination, extracting motivation from text, and evocation, constructing an image from text, may I request a discussion on perceived gaps in Buildcraft. As part of Genshin Impact's public release roster, Beidou carries one of many banners of misshapen or lacking design. The exact perception will vary from person to person, but let's jump right into it. Beidou's level 70 passive has 5 functional clauses. It does 5 things. You won't believe number 3. That made me laugh out loud when I read this Parley. Clauses 1 and 2 are mutually exclusive, with clauses 3 through 5. The player cannot benefit from all of them at the same time, but as they're all under the umbrella of the same passive, the player is almost certainly benefiting from something. So if you're following along, the idea that this character has an effect, that you can't use every aspect of the effect all at the same time, but there's a lot of different aspects. You're probably going to use one or another of them at any given time. An open-ended passive, but this Parley is going to be about a little bit the idea of not being able to use everything in a character's kit at once, or certain things in a character's kit not communicating which things are good to use with other things. The rub, then, is Beidou's Constellation 4, which we actually have right here at the bottom. When Beidou hits with her normal attacks, the enemy takes a separate damage packet of Electro. According to the mechanical text, the primary source of a player's information before engaging with the community, only her normal attacks give you the extra damage. Game, you just told me whatever I want to do is fine with Beidou's level 70 passive. Why are you communicating that only normal attacks will work now? And to look at the image, you can see that EyePatchNotes has given us some examples of how Beidou's kit frequently says, her burst that gives you a chain lightning buff. You can do it with normal or charged attacks. Her Ascension passive, I think, at level 70, normal attacks are faster and stronger, charge attacks are faster and stronger, charge attacks start faster when you get the perfect counter, right? So again, lots of different effects, but it's, again, clear the character is saying normal and charge attacks will work, are good. You do whichever, it's fine. But then suddenly, even though everywhere else in the character's kit it says normal or charge attacks, this one thing only works for normal attacks, so it says. Now, as EyePatchNotes has included a little spoilered out bit, I think I know where this is going. EyePatchNotes says, anyway, the mechanical text is misleading. Beidou's charge attacks actually do trigger that effect. Even though it says they don't, they do. The player just wouldn't know that without targeted testing or learning the truth from somewhere. The Electro packets are also tagged as burst damage, apparently. When looking at a character's Constellation 4 effect, which is largely something the player must intentionally reach for, because you need 5 copies of the character to get it, any mistranslation or obfuscation of text is needlessly frustrating. There's a lot going on in this Parley, and EyePatchNotes and I have talked a lot about the Genshin Impact design stuff over these Parleys and also during streams. So I'm going to recap a little bit, like the situation for this character. And increasingly, these are really helping me understand what your problem is with this stuff, EyePatchNotes. So I want to dig into that. So leaving this up for a sec. This example, the idea is there's a problem with kind of 2 things. First of all, the mechanical description, at least in English, of this effect where normal attacks get extra electro damage is literally just wrong. It does give charge attacks more extra damage, but it just doesn't say it does. It is literally just incorrect. It does not say the right thing. Genshin Impact has a lot of problems with this. It's translated from the Chinese, and a lot of the time the exact wording, it's the kind of game where a one little and or, for example, sometimes is all it is, makes or breaks a character seeming good or bad in a certain way. An example I experienced myself was with Tartaglia. Now, he has this thing where he can mark enemies with this Riptide marker. And when he hits enemies that have it, they do a bunch of watery damage slashes around them. Extra damage, and it hits in a small area. So if you group enemies very tightly, it can be a lot of damage. Now, when he first came out, the talent that that gave you the damage didn't properly describe how you get the marks, making it sound like basically any hit while he was using his water blades would give you the little marks. So, okay, it's fine, no problem. But actually, it was when you got a crit with the water blades. You needed a crit and the water blades, not a crit or the water blades. That's my memory of how it was anyway. And so it kind of seemed like, oh, it's totally fine. You know, you'd want to build critical strikes anyway, by the way. But at the time, we thought, oh, no big deal. He'll be very effective, even at pretty low investment. You just get the marks. But you just didn't. That just was not true. You have to get a crit with the water blades out. There's another way to get the marks too. It's not a mechanical problem, right? Like, we're not talking about for Beto, for example. The damage from her Constellation 4 effect affecting her charge attacks doesn't like matter as per se mechanically, but that's not what we're discussing. The problem is, well, really two problems, that it just doesn't say, which makes the player feel like, wait a minute, why though? I thought you could do this charge attack thing. Why is there this part of this character's kit that just, it wouldn't be powerful if it did affect her charge attacks, so why doesn't it affect them? That seems to fly in the face of satisfying game design where you can use everything together. Again, this is really not about the power level of the effect. But there's other things too, like you mentioned. I think this is a nice detail, that the electro damage you get from that effect is kind of randomly burst damage. Genshin Impact sometimes does and sometimes doesn't say what a type of damage counts as, which is just bad. Like, that's just not good, of course. A lot of games have a problem with this. I think that when developers see that it's unclear, they generally agree that you should change it. What I'm critiquing here, personally anyway, is mostly going to be that they don't work harder to avoid those lacks of clarity. I mean, to me, and I think to EyePatchNotes, if you don't mind me assuming so, this is kind of like if an ability's description just didn't say everything the ability did. It basically doesn't say everything the ability does. It does damage, but what kind of damage? It says it does electro damage, but that it is burst damage or skill damage or normal attack damage is as much a part of the effect description as that it even does damage. You could argue that it's fine for the player that isn't going to, you could say, optimize or whatever. But at that point, you could just say damage. It doesn't even matter what kind of damage. You see what I'm trying to say? It's an obviously wrong level of specificity. And I guess the frustration is just that it can't help but feel to a lot of people like when the developer doesn't include that stuff, it means the developer wrongly believes that it doesn't matter, and they are just mistaken. Like, it's not really a meaningfully different amount of detail. Plenty of people do want that information. It's not really negative for the people that don't. There's a lot to discuss here, though. Off the top of my head, without getting too much into everything you could discuss with this topic, I think we should probably break down reasons why sometimes developers don't include a bunch of details. I'm not sure you care about that too much, but I do. I think it's relevant. Why having there be some parts of a character's kit that don't always work together can be perceived as desirable, could be positive, but is it really necessary? And we'll go from there. I think I have a little bit more to say, but let's start with those two. Okay, so the first thing, this idea of omitting information sort of purposefully. Beto, I'm going to have you step aside for a sec, actually. Although it's very satisfying that she, a captain of a ship, is behind the pirate wheel. When I looked at it out of the corner of my eye, I thought that was part of it, like part of the image, but then it goes away and it's just, oh, very satisfying. Anyway, really, really good. Was that intentional, EyePatchNotes? Anyway, yeah, so the omitting information because the developer thinks they shouldn't overwhelm the player is usually what it is. A lot of the time, a game will mysteriously omit the numbers from some of its abilities. And I don't think it's very often because the game is ignorant of the player's desire for those numbers. I think more often, I don't know, by the way, but I believe more often, and I have talked to some people who are in charge of this stuff before, not very many, but a few in the industry, and they have often said the player will look up the details if they want them. So it's better to keep them out of the base game because then it won't overwhelm or turn off a newer player who isn't as interested in that complexity. You don't need to care about that complexity, and that's true in many of these games. So keeping it out of the game helps keep the game less overwhelming for the casual player, and the player who wants that information can find it anyway, basically. I really strongly believe, but I don't know, that this is almost entirely negative, actually. There really is no benefit. I think that the developer disregards the many people, the large group of people for whom it is confusing that it isn't in the game, and the secondary resources are not always eminently clear. You can't necessarily just figure out that information, from another player or from the wiki or something. Even if, and some of these developers do this, to be fair, even if the developer actually has a first party wiki that literally says what the effect is, that is not always clear. For one of the games I'm referring to, I didn't know for years that the wiki actually literally was like the developers saying what's in the wiki. And here's the kicker, it's not always right. Even though it's the developers who make the game putting the stuff there, it's just not always correct. I do feel like putting the information right next to the effect in game really puts a lot of pressure on it being wrong. It helps your players discern whether it is incorrect. You'll find out way quicker than if it's just buried in a wiki article and someone sees that it's wrong but just assumes it's normal for it to be wrong because some random person wrote this rather than the developers, I really do think that there's a very large kind of hidden negative there. There's a group of people that aren't going to go find out on their own, but do want to know. I think that's actually a larger group than it might seem. Another thing is that I personally feel like there's not much meaning in the choices if the player isn't meant to understand them. The argument for keeping it simple so as not to overwhelm the player would be an argument for doing the build crafting, for the player, not for letting the player do the build crafting, but not telling the player what the build crafting does. It doesn't really make sense. Games have various really interesting, in my opinion, topic for another time, solutions to this problem, by the way. Lots of games will have like really obvious, upgrades or mods or whatever that you can put on that it's meant to just be understood that that's a lot of damage. You don't have to really know whether it's a lot of damage. It's clearly a lot of damage. And then upgrades maybe get less obvious later. Some games do have an auto setup function for their build systems. There are games where a lot of the work in the system is done by the limited resources the player has. In other words, for a while, the player doesn't even have any different options for what to put on. And the early options are good so that if the player puts them on and then doesn't want to change it later, they have something good. And if the player does want to change later, well, they get more options. Cool. Pretty elegant. That's a very pretty piece of design, but it can often not work. Your game might have to be pretty linear for that to work well. Anyway, it's a thing some games do. In any case, I personally feel very strongly that, and I'm sure EyePatchNotes, we can agree, it would be good if games included all the information. There's really not a great reason that's eminently clear and supported by the evidence that the game should uncomplicate its text. That would be an argument for removing the decision point, not for making it less clear. That doesn't really make sense. And I truly believe that what it boils down to is that the developer maybe doesn't know that very few people are having a better experience because they didn't put attention into that thing. Things like the cooldown of an effect and stuff should be considered the core part of the description. That's not an extra piece of information. That's in there. That's the main description of the ability. And to be fair, every time I have seen a developer notice that this is unclear, they have usually been amenable to putting it in, but I don't have a ton of experience in this area. I have a separate topic, again, maybe also for another time, about considering just giving the player an option to toggle on more involved tooltips. Some games do a great thing where, you can like hold a button and you get all the details or less details, stuff like that. Great. Yeah, write multiple descriptions for your ability. That I think that's good. And let the player pick. Perfectly fine. If you think there's some merit to a shorter description, like that's cool. I just really don't see. You seen how many menus a lot of games have nowadays? It's not like they can't just put the information in. Anyway, like there's plenty of space. All right, moving on. But I did want to establish, there is a counterforce here that I believe we should really just grow out of. And games are trending in this direction. More and more games, in my experience with these involved build systems, contain the information on the build system in the game. Like that, to my eye, it appears to be increasing. So I have a lot of hope that the game industry will just kind of mature out of this idea that you should omit the basic functionality of abilities. That's just weird. Again, you can totally have your cake and eat it too here. You could write a description that does omit that complexity, but then simply allow the player to hold a button or whatever to see the complexity, it's not even the complexity, just what the ability does. Anyway, cool. But yeah, I don't know, this game is translated, so it's hard. Fair enough, but it's a big problem. It matters. And again, I really do feel that it's not necessarily just a translation issue. It's a matter of, they care a lot about the translation when it has political implications, but this is a basic functionality for the game. It's like a glitch is how I feel like. But people don't, I believe developers really just don't have the mindset yet always that it is bad. It is a core flaw. It's not an extra little detail. This is a core aspect of the game. It's like not even writing what a character's ability does, which that's obviously really bad. They would correct that instantly, right? Stuff like that. Anyway, whereas this has been in the game for forever. So, okay, but kind of to the main body of discussion. We've sort of talked about an example, but to get to the meat and potatoes. EyePatchNotes, I'm gonna sort of take over a little bit here because I have something I think is interesting and relevant to this topic. I would have said in the past that this whole thing about having lots of different parts of the ability that don't all work together, I would have said in the past that that's fine or good because it allows the player to tackle a character in different ways. So let me give you an example. So for Beidou, it's a little different because while these effects give you normal or charge attack, and indeed you can't do a normal and charge attack at the same time, it's basically just saying it affects both. It's you're not really not using all of the aspects of the effect, in my opinion anyway. It's just like saying you get damage for everything, and if you got damage increased for everything, I would argue we wouldn't be complaining about, you can't technically use your burst and a normal attack at the exact same moment, so you can't use them both at the same time. But for all intents and purposes, the game is just saying this works for everything. And again, Beidou has that unclear Ascension passive. But I want a more extreme example, something where there's an effect that is for one specific thing over here, but then also a totally different effect for a specific thing over here. Not something like, for me, this is a gray area. This middle effect, her Ascension 4 passive, Beidou's normal and charge attacks get faster and stronger when she does the perfect counter, and then charge attacks start more quickly. Again, I kind of feel like that's basically just saying your attacks all get a damage increase. You technically can't use them both together, but I don't feel like that lowers the sort of power budget, and that's something we're going to get into. Of the effect that much. I kind of get what you mean. I feel like this is a good example for that, but I want another one. The one I'm going to use is Diona. Diona is a character that doesn't do too significant damage. She heals and provides shields, but you get those with HP, so you're not increasing your attack, so you're not increasing, your normal attack damage or whatever. But she's got this weird effect that gives her faster charge shots. You can fire off a bunch of icy arrows really quickly while you're in her burst area, which has nothing to do with the rest of her kit. There's nothing relating to charge attack support. There's nothing encouraging you to keep her on the field at all after you use her abilities. There's nothing in her kit that would make her do good charge attack damage. Indeed, you might say from a game design perspective, that's why it's okay for her to have such a big charge attack charge boost, because it's not that powerful. It's not out of control powerful because she doesn't do much charge attack damage. Yeah, but it can feel a little random. It's like, why this is what we're doing now? Like, is sort of the attitude. That's a little odd. Similarly, she has that effect at the end of her constellations that gives her some elemental mastery for the team. A good effect, but it kind of comes out of nowhere. Was this character interested in reactions? That just seems a little random. You could argue that is an unfocused theme. In any case, the charge attack thing, it just seems weird. It's like the way a lot of people would be using her, they would get that effect. And you get another copy of the character, you're excited to have there be like some new thing you have, right? And the problem with some of these effects is that for a lot of people, it feels like they didn't get anything, sort of, or you can't use that stuff altogether. I want to get into for a minute that it isn't a power budget problem. It's not. That doesn't really matter. But for a while, I've kind of said, yeah, it's not a power budget problem. So this is just another thing for people that like it. No big deal. I don't know, actually. I'm not sure that's really necessary to give a character lots of options. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. I'll try to explain what I mean. The power budget thing first. You might think, oh, well, it's bad if a character has 6 constellations and 2 ascension passives, and this character has one of them that just doesn't do anything for the way I'm playing them, because you can't use them all, in the same playstyle or all at the same time or whatever. This one feels irrelevant. However it is, whether it's the Beto example, that's fine, or this Diona example, whatever it is, you can't use them all at the same time. So this character has like less passives, so they're less powerful, but of course they're not. That's not a thing. You could just consider that one to not be there. The number of effects on a character doesn't determine how strong they are, of course. You'll hear lots of people complain about this, mind you, because it's an easy number to cite to say this character only has 2 relevant passives. Like, yeah, but that's a really bad argument. Like, of course it's irrelevant. You could just make the 2 passives that are relevant really powerful. That it has nothing to do with the character's power level that they have, less relevant passives. But why though? But why do they have less relevant passives? I have said in the past that I think it's reasonable to consider this is just something that in Genshin Impact they put in as a kind of a hook or a toy for people that really like that character and just want to use them that way. Genshin Impact is a very character-driven game, and some people might just really like Beto, and they want to use her for her charge attacks or whatever. I don't think Beto's a great example of that. She's fine at doing charge attacks. Diona, they might just really like Diona, and they want to use her charge attacks. They just want to. It's not effective to do so, but there's lots of other goals you could have when you play a game with build options, so they just wish to use her charge attacks. And the game gives you some hook for doing that. There's some little some way in which it's a little more interesting or special to do that with that character. I still think that's why Genshin Impact does this, but a lot of games have a similar problem to this, and I generally then say something to the effect of, well, but it means that the character doesn't have as linear a way to be built. What I mean is, maybe this opens up, Diona's a bad example of this, but a charge attack build and like an HP supportive build. Now on Diona, this doesn't work at all. Like, that's just not powerful. If the developers thought that that was powerful and put it in because they think it is powerful, they would be wrong. It's not. There isn't really a way for almost anyone's account for that to be powerful in the context of the other options they had. It'll get by. If you invest in it, it'll work. The game is relatively nicely balanced that way, sure, but it's not gonna do you much good. If you just want to, of course that's fine, but if you just wanted to, you could have done it anyway. It doesn't make it good where it would have been bad before. So that's not a good example, but you can think of examples where this is the case, where a character has some aspect of their kit over here that's good, probably pretty simple, because they need room for this other aspect of their kit over here that's also good, but they're not going to be good at the same time. I would have said in the past that, yeah, like this means that players have more of an option when they build that character. But that's a bad argument. Are you saying that you can't build characters different ways if they only have one linear way to be constructed? No, of course I'm not saying that. I would then say, of course, there's lots of games, most every game, where there isn't really multiple useful ways to use the base kit on a character, but there's still interesting build diversity for that character because the build options available are interesting. For example, I don't personally think that Diona is very effective if you build her any way other than for her healing, building for HP and her shields and her healing. But what artifacts, what weapon you use to make her good at that role, yeah, there are some options. I have something I think is significantly better than all the other options. But are there no other options I would consider? No. Yeah, there's a few things, sure. I don't think they're as good, but they're good in some different ways. I just don't find those ways compelling. You see what I'm trying to say? You don't need the character to have a fragmented, or EyePatchNotes is saying to have gaps in their build approach. That doesn't have to be true for the character to have interesting build diversity. I think for a little too long, I've argued almost that not that needs to be the case, but as if that is a good reason to do that, which I guess it isn't. Like, you could definitely make a game. A lot of these games are partially games where there are some characters that are united in their goal. Everything in their kit works in concert, but there's still interesting build decisions to be made. If you wanted to have another different role for a character that you could build differently, you could simply make another character and have them do that stuff. And indeed, they mercifully often do. But a lot of the time, yeah, like that doesn't happen. And I'm not convinced there's no good reason to do that, but I'm not sure there is a good reason to do that. Yeah. So I can get behind you a little bit, EyePatchNotes. I've in the past said, if they're in Genshin Impact, if they're putting in this little strength at something random like charge shots or whatever for Diona, it's not like they magically don't know that that is extremely weak compared to other available options. They do know that. They must then have put it in because they want like this a hook available for other players. But we've also talked a lot in the past about how developers pretty frequently, understandably, put things in the game without a very specific use case for them in mind. They just say, yeah, like in theory, applying some extra elemental stuff to enemies with rapid fire charge shots could be useful. So we'll just kind of put that in and players will figure out for themselves what is effective. We do this in lots of games. There are many times where it's just not practical to understand every possible interaction. A really good example of a game that is kind of constantly at war with this is Path of Exile, where the tree of different things you can pick for your character, the big passive tree, has enough different combinations that it would be unreasonable to expect a developer to make sure they're all perfectly balanced. And indeed, there often are like way more powerful ones in a given season. But then those seasons reset every few months, at least on the servers that do that, causing you to, go back to the start. And it's not too oppressive if there's a single strategy. That's the idea. I'm not sure I'm the biggest fan, but it's an interesting idea. There are also games where we take it as a virtue that things don't need to be perfectly balanced. We're just going to let the players figure out, what is an interesting way to do it. And if they come up with something that's oddly easy, well, good for them for being clever. A good example of this would be a lot of tabletop role-playing games. Often the leader, the game master, the dungeon master, their role is to some extent to mediate the players in some way, to say to them, you see this in the room, figure out how to move forward. And in their notes, they don't know what the way to move forward is. They maybe have a layout, they got some trapdoors, but the player says, what are the walls made of? And the game leader says something to the effect of, oh yeah, they're like packed dirt. Oh, I see where this is going. Yeah, there's like a stone tile over the top. You're not sure what's underneath. The player says, oh, I pry it up. It's dirt. They say, yep. And they say, I summon an earth elemental to tunnel us through do like that. And the game leader might decide something gets in the way of that, or there's a defensive enchantment or not. And they just have to find out how to find a place to come to surface. For example, maybe they use some sonic locating ability somehow, I don't know. And they may or may not let that go. They might say, oh, well, this is an enchanted crypt. You can't dig through the floor easily. That's fine. But you might say, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, like it would be interesting to see how the players will, you dig into the ground. How do you know what direction to go in? They have to come up with something. And that can be really fun. That's not necessarily bad. Leaving it somewhat open-ended to create what is sometimes called organic game design, where a build comes to light not because it was specifically engineered to work that way, but just because the developers made an educated guess that this thing would be reasonable or useful, and then they kind of put it out into the game and waited for the players to find out how it would be useful. Like, that's normal, but not what Genshin Impact is doing. And I have a question. Is it necessary, though? Is that really necessary? Does it not happen if you don't put those extra things into the game? If you don't put these kind of hanging, who knows specifically what people will do with this, but it's like basically, okay, our intention is that it be somewhat open-ended and players figure it out. Do you need to do that to have kind of organic buildcraft, basically? No, clearly not. You can definitely make characters that are all focused, all their parts work together. And yet there is this sort of organic, it's surprisingly interesting to, put this on this character or whatever. An example for me in Genshin Impact would be on Goro, a Geo support unit that's focused on defense. Goro has this constellation effect that gives him a minor healing effect if you have Geo units on the team. Consider that to be not so minor, and he doesn't benefit much from building stats. He's got this weirdness where he doesn't really do that much damage, and he buffs his party, including himself, with flat defense, which is what he scales everything he does with, his healing, his damage for whatever little he does. A lot of what he provides isn't really a stat you can build. So even though the healing is a pretty minor part of his kit, I consider it to be as valuable as anything else to just build him for the healing part, even though it's supposed to be this kind of side thing, maybe. They made it have a kind of minor level of power and just kind of let players go ahead. You don't have to focus him on that, or you can if you want to, leading to an open-ended build experience that doesn't feel unrelated to the rest of his kit. He's a unit all built around supporting a bunch of Geo units, so him healing a bit more when he's supporting a Geo team makes sense. His whole thing is he's a smattering of utility for Geo teams. You can certainly use the benefit of that healing effect while he's doing everything else he does. So it's not necessarily this kind of gap in game design or buildcraft. At least if I'm understanding EyePatchNotes correctly, I don't think it is, in your definition of that idea. And yet, it does lead to relatively open game design. There's just a legitimately interesting choice to be made between building for that or not. They both don't do much, so you can decide which you want to do. Indeed, sometimes a trap that games fall into, I think, is that they go for low stakes as a way to create, hopefully, the feeling of meaningful build choices, but it ends up just not mattering at all what you pick. I think in this case, Genshin Impact hit a good compromise. I think you get a meaningful benefit from building Goro that way, but you get some damage if you build him for actual damage too. There's enough overlap. I think you should just build him for the healing, by the way. I'm using Maiden Beloved for those of you keeping score at home. The community is actually kind of into that build, the healing Goro build. I found out that's actually a somewhat popular thing. Anyway, cool. My point is, I don't know. EyePatchNotes in the past, I had come out pretty strong saying, like, yeah, it's okay that you don't like it when a character has a kind of hanging detail in their design that doesn't seem like it works with the rest of their kit. But, it's fine that you care about that. But in the past, I've kind of said it like, that is your personal thing, and it's not really a problem in general. It's just something you personally dislike. But there's kind of no advantage, actually, like, as I break it down. But why, though? Like, is it really needed to do that? Why is the decision in a lot of Genshin Impact interesting, even if the character's stuff is all working together at once? Well, it's because the game has an inherently meaningful build system. It's because elemental combinations, elemental resonances, running multiple of an element, and the limited, relatively high impact per piece gear system that we have in Genshin Impact causes decisions to be inherently meaningful. It gives you, the player, the power to meaningfully increase the magnitude of anything a character does, meaning that even if a character does everything kind of all together, there's nothing sort of hanging loose that doesn't work with everything else, even if that's the case, you still have the ability to kind of push the character in one direction or another based on your needs, and people totally do. So I would say, at least for Genshin Impact, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of with you, actually. You have changed my mind. I've changed my mind. It is inferior to designing the game so that things do all work together, because every benefit of not designing things so they don't all work together can be acquired another way. You don't need to make design awkward that way to get those benefits. It is, I think you would say, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, please tell me if this is wrong, but I think you've said in the past, it feels more lazy or like a mistake, or they didn't pull that design together enough. They don't care about that design as much. I know certainly some other people on the stream, you folks feel that way. And I don't. I think it's because they consider it to be beneficial in some way. But breaking it down, I don't agree that it is beneficial. I feel like that's not necessary. Some caveats, however. I do think that to some extent, it's a matter of taste. A big aspect of making builds that I for a long time neglected, and I'm really trying to get into more now, is your personal experience, quality of life, but also things just feeling good to the player. The whole point is that you can choose what you run on a character, so it's not at all mistaken to focus making a build on something that just feels good to you, or you just really like that character has that strength. That's just satisfying or fun to you. To me, it is elegant, beautiful, the way that the instructor set works on Bennett. It's good on Bennett. There's lots of ways you could say like it's effective and stuff, but I don't actually care. It just feels right to me. And that's totally fine. Like, that's the intention of these games. They want you to be able to choose. So if something feels a bit off, like, you're not only within your rights, like, sure, it's valid how you feel about the thing. I would argue that's kind of the point, is for you to feel like, oh, I don't like that as much. But I don't think it's always a game design problem. An example you've brought up before, EyePatchNotes, is with Noelle, a really good example that I hope is easy to follow abstractly, folks. Noelle is a character that can provide a pretty powerful shield. If she's attacking with her shield, she can heal the team. She's got this big, powerful burst damage effect. She's a great, sort of primary, you could maybe think of her as a tank. Now, she also has a passive effect that when another character, not her, on your team gets really low health, she'll shield them. Is this a gap in the character's kit? Is this not working in concert with everything else? Well, you could say yes, because the whole thing about Noelle is that she's a field hog. She's going to be on the field. She's tanking. Who cares if you've got a shield for someone else? They won't need it. That's the entire thing she accomplishes, is making them not need it, right? Okay, on the other hand, her whole thing is that she protects the team. So when you do swap to your other characters, which you have to do to get their abilities out, you don't have to, but if you're going to use other characters at all, you need to put them on the field for a very small amount of time. And she's got a passive that even when she isn't the one holding down the field, she can actually still protect your team a little bit. To me, that feels quite thematic. Like, I know you don't feel that way. We've talked about this specific example before, EyePatchNotes and I. But I think that makes sense. It's a little awkward. It's a little random. It makes sense from like a new player perspective, because you get Noelle for free as part of the tutorial process, pretty much. But I also think that thematically it does fit. It is a matter of interpretation for that case, right? It's something that in the process of using Noelle, you will have that effect's conditions come up. It's just like, does this really feel like a good thing for the character to have? It's not the same as something where to use one of the character's passives, you must always avoid the situation where another one would come up. It's not like that. It's just on the border, I think. For me anyway, that is one that is a matter of taste. Perfectly fine, by the way. Developers, I'm not sure what to say about this one. Should you avoid this? I mean, you don't have to listen to me anyway, but do I think that this is kind of inferior to not including it the way I do with things you just can't use altogether? Why not just make another character for those things? Why not make those effects be a weapon or an artifact, something you can add to a character? But what about something like this that's kind of on the edge? I kind of like these. EyePatchNotes, I know some of what you like about some other build system games, so I'm going to try to sell you these a little bit. It's probably not going to work. And here's how. Sometimes when these effects are kind of on the edge of being effective, I almost feel like it's a bit of a puzzle to figure out how they actually are part of the character's main kit, basically. Some of them the Genshin Impact examples will be simple, but it'll illustrate my point. Tartaglia has this passive effect where part of his character is that he's a master of weapons. He's good with a lot of different weapons. He uses his Hydro Vision to manifest different weaponry, pairs of daggers, a polearm, etc. And he uses these weapons to attack. His main weapon is a bow, but from a flavor perspective, he says he's using a bow because he's not good at fighting with a bow yet. He is a character who part of his character is that he's in the process of mastering a variety of weaponry, and he's very good with a lot of different weapons. He's got a talent then that for flavor, first of all, is called Master of Weaponry, I believe. And it gives every character on your team an increase to the level of their normal attacks. So it makes all your characters a little bit better with their weapons, basically. But why, though? He's an attacker, so why does he have a thing that buffs your other units? Well, his skill has a cooldown that is equal to its duration, basically. Not exactly equal. The longer you use it, the longer you have to wait before you use it again, roughly. People who play Tartaglia, you know what I'm talking about. Give me a break. It's basically like that. So when you play him, you will need to have some other character significantly attacking, and he makes that other character, who is kind of part and parcel of the play experience you will end up having with him, he's going to make them more effective. Now, I wonder, EyePatchNotes, if you feel like that is a little awkward, like the Noelle example, because it does fit the play experience you'll have with the character, but it's not the character per se, you know? It makes them a little bit less self-sufficient, you could kind of argue. And you like it when characters are really small, intimate sets. Maybe that's part of why you dislike that? I don't know. I'm just speculating at that point. I know you sometimes like it when a game has, you can kind of puzzle out the details or discern the intent from the developer. In some games, we've talked about this with Nova Drift, you and I have. And in Genshin Impact, I hope this isn't too much of an assumption, that the problem for you is partially that it feels like the developer doesn't have like a relevant enough plan for the characters. It feels haphazard or careless why certain details were put in. So to try to figure out the puzzle of why something is mechanically relevant in Genshin Impact would make you feel like a fool at times. You would be tricked into thinking there was a good reason, but there just isn't sometimes. By the way, I don't know if I agree with that. I think a lot of the time there is, and players are distracted by the inelegance. That's what I've often thought about how you feel. That it's actually not a problem, but it's just distractingly ugly, basically. Now, again, in this parlay, I've decided I agree, but maybe it just doesn't have to be ugly. Like, that's just bad. But it doesn't make the character actually bad. It just might be less desirable, which is perfectly valid, by the way. I don't know. I personally feel like these pieces of seemingly hanging design are what I'm getting at, basically, is that what completely changes them is if you just assume the developer is good, basically. In Nova Drift, I have come to understand that the developer is smart. Like, when a thing is in the game, it is generally pretty good. The game has kind of earned my confidence about that. So when I see a new effect that seems very random, when I see something that seems like, but why did you do this? I have gained faith that that is relevant somehow, that they came to that because at some point it came up that it was good for it to have that drawback or be balanced that way. And if it seems really weak to me, that's probably because the game has earned my confidence. I don't know why it's good yet. In Genshin Impact, I don't feel that way. There's a critical mass enough of things that are just bad in the eyes of me and the millions of people global community that play the game, that I don't have confidence when something seems weird in Genshin Impact that it is good, because that confidence isn't warranted. It just, a good amount of the time it is just bad. So I just don't have that confidence anymore. That being said, for me in Genshin Impact, the developers are maybe getting a lot of safety net. Maybe this is bad. Maybe this is why they're not taking as much care to make things good. By the fact that the character's build tools are fairly powerful. If something isn't that strong, we have such powerful tools at our disposal that it may very well be able to be made to be powerful. It just, not always, of course, but a good amount of the time, some random hanging claws can be harnessed to be something quite powerful. Not because it is really any good inherently, but simply because the character's tools are strong enough, the player's tools, excuse me, are strong enough. I think that can be really fun. If it can be relatively balanced, which I think in Genshin Impact it kind of is, but that's a complicated topic. I don't know. I guess what I was trying to sell is the idea that sometimes these, what you might perceive as gaps, could be an interesting puzzle, and it is there's a large gray area where it kind of is a matter of opinion, but then sometimes it goes too far and that is just kind of awkward and unnecessary. Sometimes it goes the other way and it really is very intentional and it feels like a puzzle that you can solve. I believe the conflict, if any, here is that there is a very wide gray area, things like Noelle's passive effect that I mentioned. So I'm curious what you think about that. This ended up being a pretty personal parlay. I hope that was okay. You've done a pretty good job communicating a lot of the stuff that you like and don't like about these games, and you've just been talking a lot, and you watch almost every stream. Like, I have a lot of input from you, so I felt equipped to try to address that. I hope that was interesting, satisfying. Thanks for the parlay. Thanks for the glorious graphic. Our pirate queen looks very nice up there.